This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting today's show is K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. This time, Joe and Drew talk about a few ways to see if your pond needs care and what resources could be used. K-State Cow-Calf Extension Specialist Jason Warner continues the show as he mentions what producers should consider when it comes to replacement heifer development and management. Completing today's show is K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk as he discusses the importance of consulting a nutritionist to increase fat percentage in milk being produced on the farm. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken on another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers.
Welcome back to the third episode of the Fins, Fur, and Feather podcast. Joe, I think we're going to talk about ponds today, or something relative to fisheries and aquatic stuff. So what do you have for us today?
You know, one of the things I thought we'd start talking about, I get a lot of calls about pond levels just being really low. And so thinking about that, a lot of people call right after a rain. And so they tell me they just had a big 1-inch rain and their pond is still low. And so that drives them to think that it's a leak. And most of the time it's just that the water tables, if we think about water in a pond, we need to think about it on a landscape level. And so this water has to reach a certain point. Think about a bathtub. It has to fill up to a point, and that's all underground. That water table's underground. We need to refill that to the bottom of the pond before we can start thinking about filling in our pond ourselves. So a 1-inch rain with the drought conditions we've had aren't going to refill that water table. And so thinking about low ponds, thought we'd touch on kind of, is it an issue with the pond? Is it because of drought, or is it a leak?
Besides the water table, what might affect how quickly a pond's going to fill up?
Pond construction would be number one, making sure that pond was constructed properly, that it can hold water to begin with. Another really big factor is the size of the watershed, and so having a properly sized watershed is really important for ponds. That's something that the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, they could really help you figure out where to put your pond and make sure that your watershed is the right size to be filling up. Some people say you can't have a watershed too big, and that's not true. If your watershed is too big, you're going to have too much water coming into your pond. That brings with it a lot of sediment. It's going to do things like start to fill in your pond and really cut down on the lifespan of your pond. And so if your watershed is too big, you might get water in there. It might fill up faster in these drought conditions than if it's too small, but that brings with it some other concerns. Obviously, if your watershed's too small, if you don't have enough water coming into your pond at all, then you're going to have a dry pond. So you need to make sure that you're kind of balancing that. If you don't have a big enough watershed, you might need to think about supplemental watering. So adding water from, another source that you may have to make sure your pond's filling up.
Is that going to be practical for most people? That sounds expensive to me.
Yeah, so it's not practical, and it's not practical long term. If you have livestock that are utilizing the pond for a watering source, it might make sense to do something then, because you need that water for those livestock anyway. So it's not going to be practical or affordable for most of our listeners to keep their pond full from a source just if they're using it for recreational activities.
It sounds like to me there's not a lot of benefits of drought for ponds. You don't have water coming into it and that sort of thing. Is there any silver lining to drought when we're thinking about managing the ponds?
Yeah, so obviously in aquatic systems you need to have water for them to be aquatic. So unless we want to turn them into prairies, which is every pond's goal in life, we need to have that water. And so there aren't any benefits necessarily to drought, but there are opportunities, right? And so talking about that heavy machinery of going in and making sure that clay is properly compacted during a drought is a great opportunity to think about managing your pond and doing some rehabilitation to your pond. So if you don't have those proper slopes because your pond is aged, it might be a good time to go in and dig out some of those sediments and get them out of your pond. It's a lot easier. It's going to be a lot cheaper. When the ponds are dry, it's easier for those operators, so that leads to cheaper prices to dig it out and get it out of the pond than it is to wait for a really wet year. So it's a really good opportunity to be thinking about going in and figuring out, can you do anything to improve those ponds? And this is a good time to do that, especially leading into the colder months. This is when you want to be doing activities like that. Colder water holds more oxygen than warm water. And so if we're thinking about fish or, other critters that might be utilizing that water, having a refuge area where those fish can go to in a higher density but still have enough oxygen, we want to do this in the colder months. So it's a good opportunity to go in and add some life to our ponds.
So how can you tell the difference between, whether or not your pond's just dry because of drought or whether it's leaking or something like that? And if is there a major problem that we need to address when we have that opportunity because the water's low because of a drought that maybe we can fix?
Yeah, so identifying a leak is something that a lot of times takes expertise. But there are a couple signs that you could see that would be like, hey, there's probably a leak. One of them is going to be easier to spot in drought. And so if you see on the back side of your dam, generally, if there's an area that just looks like it's been constantly watered, it's bright green, it's growing like crazy, the vegetation there's really happy, that's probably an indication that water is coming out of your pond and leaking into that area. And so, or if you're on the back side, you're walking along and you see a swampy area where it's still really wet in the conditions we have, those are some really good indicators that there's some sort of leak going on. Another big thing is how the pond fills up after a rainfall. And so when a pond fills up, we're going to lose that water in a lot of different ways. It might go out a spillway on the downstream side of the pond. We're going to lose some to evaporation, but that's going to occur kind of slowly. So if your pond fills up and it just kind of steadily looks like it's slowly dropping, an inch or two a week, that's normal. That's what we would expect. If the pond fills up after a rain and then quickly drops down to a point and then kind of levels off, that's an indication of a leak. And so if you think about all that water, when the pond fills up, there's a lot of water pushing down on the water at the bottom of the pond where leaks normally are. It's called hydrostatic pressure. So that pressure is pushing that water out of the bottom of the pond, just like if you were squeezing a sponge or something. You're forcing it out of those holes. When you get rid of half of that water or whatever amount to get that hydrostatic pressure equalized, there's not enough force pushing that water out anymore, the pond stops leaking. So if you see after a rain, the pond fills up and then quickly drops down, and it's always kind of the same level it drops down to quickly, that's another indication that you would have a leak in your pond or may have a leak in your pond.
Are there any things that might be more obvious that you could look for maybe on the pond dam or something like that could give you an idea that you might ought to be thinking about a leak?
One of the big things are trees, right? And so we see a lot of trees, a lot of tree roots that are growing. And so, I've gone out and met with landowners that have water seeping through the roots. The roots form a nice pathway. The water likes to flow along that surface, and it can quickly erode the dam itself. And so the dam is going to end up failing. If you see water coming out the back, you see a hole in your dam, stuff like that would be something we'd want to consider.
So if you do have leaks and there's nothing obvious like trees on the dam or beaver dens that have washed out or something like that, how could you think about fixing those leaks?
One of the big things I get asked is bentonite. Can we use bentonite? And bentonite's cheap. It's been around forever. A lot of people have used bentonite. And bentonite works really well in two main ways. The most popular is called the blanket method. And this is when they're constructing a pond. They dig it a little bit deeper, generally about 6 or 8 inches deeper than they normally would. They put a layer of bentonite and compact that into the clay and then put another layer of clay over top. Bentonite works really well because it can absorb a lot of water, somewhere between 10 and 15 times its weight in water it can absorb. So when it does that, it swells up and it can help to create a layer where there's not going to be any water coming out of the bottom of the pond. That has to be done when the pond is constructed. The other method that works really well is called the mixed method, and that's what it sounds like. You mix that in with the clay, generally with some sort of tiller when the pond is being constructed, and then you use a sheepfoot roller to compact that layer down. That technique generally works better unless you have really steep slopes on the pond, but those two ways work really, really well. What people are often asking me about is called the sprinkle method. The sprinkle method is when you buy a bunch of bentonite and you go sprinkle it on the surface of your pond, and you hope that it's going to sink down to the bottom and fill in the gaps. And generally, that's not very successful unless you drain your pond and kind of mix it in those ways that we talked about. If you're going to do that, you'd want to make sure that you specifically bought a granular bentonite, not an agricultural bentonite, which is a lot more available. A granular bentonite is a lot more successful than just agricultural bentonite, but again, still, it's not going to be as successful as we would like it to be.
Are there any other cool things that can be used to plug those holes if we got a leaky pond?
One of the cool things that are out there are called cross-link polymers. They kind of bend together and they make like a gel that swells up and fills in gaps. If you think about Expand-A-Foam, it has that same kind of idea in a water setting. There's two different main ones that are out there. One's called Soil Flock and one's called Dammit. But basically, you want to do this when your pond is full. We talked about that hydrostatic pressure pushing water down into those cracks or leaks. The idea is that your pond is full and it's going to push these cross-link polymers wherever the leak is. And so it's going to be able to fill in those cracks. It's going to expand and kind of seal them. They work well when they work. It's kind of an expensive gamble, you know. So you'd want to kind of have an idea where your leak is. That's when you might want to call in an expert and they'll help kind of pinpoint where the leak is. And then you could apply those cross-link polymers. They're really messy, but they have a much higher success rate than the sprinkle method of the bentonite, for example. So if you want to go that route of applying something to your pond, that generally would be a little more successful. Unfortunately, the answer a lot of times is to rebuild your pond. So going back to the opportunities that the drought presents, it might be a good time to rebuild your pond, or if it's really, really bad, it is often cheaper to just start over and build a new pond somewhere else in your watershed.
All right. Well, I guess that's a wrap for this episode, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Once again, that was Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken. I will put a link in today's show notes on agtoday.net if you'd like to listen to the full episode. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Tuesday show discussing replacement heifer development and management with Kansas State University Extension cow-calf specialist Jason Warner. Jason, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
You're very welcome, Shelby. Thanks for the opportunity to have me on, as always.
Jason, as we kick off today's conversation, discussing why it's important to think about what you might want to do with replacement heifers.
So we're getting into a time of the year here in the fall where a lot of producers, particularly with spring calving cow herds, are going to be making some decisions as far as heifer retention and making some key decisions as far as which heifers they want to retain back into their herd and breed and develop as yearlings this coming up next year. And so it's a really important time, I think, for folks to really look at their overall goals and objectives for their operation, see where their cow herd is from an inventory standpoint, and make some targeted replacement heifer decisions this coming up year. I think this is a really important year for folks to be reviewing this and just keeping in mind what their overall goals and objectives are for their operation, really for a couple of reasons. The first is that, as we know and we've talked about a lot of times in the past on this show, we've had a lot of variability in terms of our moisture and forage conditions around the state this year, and that certainly is going to have a big impact on how producers will look at the decision to keep females and expand the cow herd, or if they decide to go ahead and market those females for feeder calves. That's really one aspect that we have to keep in mind with it. And the other aspect is that they're going to bring a lot of money this coming up year. There's a lot of value for those females. The cost of feeder calves is really important. And this year, depending on the weight of a feeder heifer right now, she might have a value per head of anywhere from $1,400 to maybe $1,600 per head. And so when we think about that, and we think about the feed costs and development costs that we're going to have, going forward through the fall and through the winter to get her developed and get her bred next spring, there's going to be a substantial economic value there with that female that's been higher than what we've had in previous years. So a couple of things for folks to keep in mind there, but certainly as we think about the industry as a whole, a lot of economic signals that I think are going to encourage cow-calf producers to retain more females, capitalizing on higher forecasted prices for future calf crops. But again, Mother Nature is going to dictate for us how and when that occurs.
Jason, what are a few considerations for producers to think about when making those replacement heifer selections?
I think it's really important for producers to go back and study your calving records really well from where that calf crop was born from, or go back and look at those calving records, because that can really tell us a lot of important information. We always want to be thinking about trying to select those females that were going to be born or that were born at the beginning of the calving season for us, because that can have some implications from a reproductive management standpoint. One, those females are going to be older and they're going to be more developed and more mature when we go to breed them. But then also, too, when we think about selecting females from those cows or from those dams that calved earlier in that calving season for us, that means they got bred earlier for us. And so that could mean we may be selecting for some improved reproductive performance there, even though reproductive traits are very lowly heritable. But still, we want to be trying to target those females that are going to be born at the beginning of that calving season. Another reason why I think it's important to go back and look at calving records, because we can record information during the calving season, but then it's oftentimes easy to forget that information as we go throughout the summer, and then we get here till now to the fall when we're starting to make some key decisions. But we want to go back and look and make sure that that female was not born to a cow or a heifer that had any calving difficulty or dystocia at calving, and so we want to make sure that we don't select females who were born to a dam that had any calving difficulty. We want to try to avoid that. Disposition, if there are any disposition comments or things that we noted about a cow at the time of calving that maybe we've forgotten about during the spring and the summer, we want to make sure that we're avoiding, bringing any females back into the herd that might be carrying some bad attitudes with them, right? The other thing that we want to keep in mind, too, is that when we think about convenience traits that are really important for overall productivity and longevity of a cow, things like teat and udder conformation are really important. Then the best time to note that and to record that on a set of cows is at calving, when those cows are going into lactation. And so if you make notes or comments on teat and udder conformation, make sure you go back and you look at that, because there is a certain degree of heritability as far as teat and udder conformation goes. And so we want to be making sure that we're selecting females that are going to have desirable teat and udder suspension and conformation as we make decisions and bring those females back into the herd. So those are some key important things that we always want to think about when we're making decisions on which females that we want to keep back. But again, target those females that were born in that first cycle of the calving season, first 2 cycles.
For those heifers that are being kept, does it make a difference in how they're developed?
It certainly can. And the big thing that we always want to think about, particularly with this year where we've got a higher initial cost on that female, again, her value as a feeder calf is higher this year than what it has been in the past just due to calf prices. And so we want to be thinking about how we can economically develop those females and get them to a proper weight and a proper condition score at first breeding. And so we just want to be thinking about being really cost effective with our feed resources. And we can do that a couple of different ways. Lots of folks, depending on what their forage resources will be, if they can have those females turned out on a low quality forage resource, whether that's dormant, winter native range, or crop residues, thinking about our supplementation rates that we're going to need to provide for those females in order to make sure that they're properly gaining and increasing plane of nutrition as we go through the winter and into the start of the breeding season. A lot of folks may be thinking about developing those females in a dry lot or in a pen-fed situation and feeding those females maybe a total mixed ration or supplementing them maybe on free choice forage or free choice hay. And so regardless of how you do it, you want to be thinking about what's the lowest cost resource for you, trying to keep that cost as low as possible, but yet developing those females in a manner such that they're gaining, usually somewhere between 1.5 pounds to 1.75 pounds a day, maybe up to 2.5 pounds a head a day from the time we wean up until the first time of breeding or up until that first service. And in most situations, we will be able to achieve that really pretty well. It's easy, I think, in a lot of situations to forget about, the overall rate of gain that we want those females to have from the time of weaning up until that first service. And so what we want folks to think about is understand where those heifers are from a weight standpoint when you wean them, when you make that decision to go ahead and keep those females for replacements, and then understand where they need to be at from a weight standpoint at first breeding, and then look at your days and calculate your average daily gain that you want to target, set your program up accordingly.
What about those heifers that are now going to be first calving heifers?
For those young females that are going to be having their first calf this coming up calving season, that's a really critical group of females that we want to make sure that we're managing properly, especially now as they go into the later stages of their second trimester and the first stages of their third trimester, depending on when they calve, because those females, they still have a requirement for growth, and they're going to continue to grow up until about their 4 years of age. And so we really want to be watching these females closely as we go into that third trimester and make sure that we're managing them such that body weight and body condition score is appropriate. For mature cows at calving, regardless of when they calve, data would suggest we want them to be in a body condition score 5 at calving. Young females, these first calf heifers, the data would suggest we want them to be at a body condition score 6 at calving, so a full condition score better. And so now, particularly if they calve, let's say, for example, if they calve the middle of February or they calve the first part of March, we really want to be thinking about looking at those females now, reading them for body condition score as we go into the next couple of months and think about our supplementation or our feed program and that we've got in front of them and make sure that we're bringing those females in the right direction. They're going to have a longer postpartum interval anyway, and so if they're thinner at calving, it's going to be more delayed. We run a greater risk of reproductive failure on those females, and that's a really critical time period for us, and so we really want to be thinking about that as it all relates to young female management with this discussion.
And if producers are looking for more information or needing to find some resources, where can they do that?
We always encourage folks to reach out to their local extension agent and their local county or district office or their local beef specialist. There's lots of good resources there that we can help provide producers and provide folks that are just needing some basic information to help make some key decisions on maybe from a ration or from a nutrition standpoint on what we want to set up for a set of females that we're going to be looking at breeding later on after the first of the year into the spring. There's a good resource out there that is called a KSU replacement calculator, and it's a spreadsheet program that was developed by our agricultural economics department here at K-State. We have that available on our beef extension website, ksubeef.org as well. It's a really nice, simple to use spreadsheet that a producer or a user can enter in some basic information about their cow herd and what their feeder calf value is going to be here on a set of replacement heifers to start with. And then what it looks at is the net present value of a replacement female in future subsequent years with increasing calf crops based on what the expected price of feeder calves is going to be, what depreciation and replacement rates will be within a given cow herd. And so it can help make that important decision whether or not it has an economic advantage to keep that female and retain her for breeding purposes or to go ahead and market that female as a feeder animal now at this time of the year and look at buying a female back to bring back into your herd as a replacement. So it can help make that distinction. And so that's a really good resource. We want folks to just keep in mind and be aware that it's available. And feel free to reach out to either your local agent or a regional or a state specialist to help guide you through that if you have any questions on that.
That was K-State Extension cow-calf specialist Jason Warner. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead.
You're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. To increase the fat percentage in the milk being produced on the farm, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk suggests working with a nutritionist. Healthy, mature dairy cows should ruminate about 8 hours a day, which requires around 6 pounds of undigested fiber each day. Mike says that a nutritionist can perform a test that determines the amount of undigested fiber that's being fed and from there can figure out the level that works best on the dairy.
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers, considering the fat test that you might be seeing in your dairy herd. As you look at the summer, and you've probably noticed a dip in your fat percentage in the milk that you're shipping off the farm during the summer due to heat stress, but as we come into fall and come out of those heat stress situations, we should see that go up. But some cases, maybe that doesn't rebound quite as fast as you would like it to rebound. So some things that you might want to consider. Heat stress is one thing that can depress the fat percentage in the milk that you're shipping off the farm, but there's also many other things. And you actually really need to work with your nutritionist on this. So just some things that you might want to work and check out with your nutritionist would be just the overall level of starch in the ration and the sources of starch. Some starch ferments much quicker, things like wheat or barley or high-moisture corn, than other types of starch. Bakery byproducts would also ferment very quickly. So it's not only the actual level of starch in the diet, but also the sources, and making sure that we do not have too much starch in there that's going to ferment very rapidly. Physical effective fiber, a lot of times we discuss this, but there's maybe some other ways that you can look at this. You know, you really want to see your animals ruminate about 8 hours a day. In order to do this, they probably need to consume about 5 1/4 to 6 pounds of undigested fiber each day. So how do you measure that and how do you work with that? Well, we do have a laboratory term called undigestible NDF at 240 hours of exposure. So if we utilize this factor and we analyze our feedstuffs, we can determine the amount of undigestible fiber that we're actually feeding. And working with your nutritionist, figure out the level that actually works on your dairy farm. Maybe it's 5.5 pounds, and if that is actually working well and you're maintaining higher fat tests with that, when you switch forages, now you have a reference that you can go back to make sure that we maintain that level of undigestible fiber in the diet. Some other things to think about: fat level and sources of fat that are in your TMRs. Unsaturated fats are what we're really concerned about, and especially when those escape the rumen. Of particular concern to us would be the 18 unsaturated fatty acids. Some of the things that we can feed that might actually help in this area would be a prilled fat made from saturated palm oil. That will actually increase fat, particularly in your later lactation animals, and increase overall fat test of the herd. Just some final things to think about: sugars. Actually, our diets many times do not contain the optimal level of sugar for fat production. Usually we want to be about 6.5% of the dry matter. Many of our rations will be much less than that. So if you're not adding some added sugars to the lactation diet, you might want to visit with your nutritionist about how you might do that. Just some final things: make sure you do feed some buffer in your diets. That does seem to help maintain the fat test, as well as maybe adding some yeast products to help maintain the rumen pH. There are also other probiotics that we could utilize that would also help keep the rumen pH slightly higher and increase fat test. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy producers to visit with their nutritionist about some options in increasing the fat percentage in the milk that is being produced on your farms.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.